Are you a fan of kitgun? I personally am, because among all the weapons you can have, kitguns are the few weapons that you can actually modify by yourself. What kind of chamber you want, the grip, and even the loader you wanted to, you can all modify by yourself. Because of this, I usually enjoy doing different kind of weapons, though I never really do it that much. Still, kitgun is one of my favorite weapons that I usually like to bring alongside with most of the missions. However, the one that actually attracted me to use kitgun is not just because of how we can modify our own weapons. Instead, it's actually quite similar to Zaw, which they have an extra arcane slot for you to use from. And for kitgun case, you can have an extra kitgun arcane slot, which available for kitgun arcanes. However, you don't really see people use kitgun more often, so you rarely know about how all this arcane does. And if you really take a look, yeah, they're really quite mediocre. However, one arcane actually always attracted me the most, and I always enjoy using it, as well as trying to test it out a lot of time. That's right, the Pax Seeker. What Pax Seeker does is more than we can ever imagine. It's just that it really needs a good kitgun to make sure that it has a good power. That's what we try to take a look in this video. So, without further ado, let's hop right into it. If you check on the Pax Seeker information, what you only know is that it will only allow you to shoot out the projectiles once you manage to headshot kill the enemies. That's all you know about the Pax Seeker. But how about the damage and all the other stuff that I have never told you about? Luckily now, all the stats are actually much better we can ever imagine. First up, it deals 50% puncture and 50% slash damage, and it's actually not a fixed number. Instead, it's based on your own kitgun base damage. In other words, if your kitgun's base damage is high, then the projectile damage will automatically be high. Secondly, all the stats are actually scaled through all the mods you equipped in your kitguns. In other words, what mods you use in your kitguns will also be used by the Pax Seeker projectiles as well. Because of this actually makes it quite useful because it can scale easily, just like the weapon you usually use. And last but not least, all the projectiles can deal force impact damage. When talk about force impact, what you think about the most? That's right, internal bleeding and hemorrhage. If let's say we want to make a kitgun which main focus on the Pax Seeker, then this kitgun you created must have this following condition. It must have high base damage, good amount of crits, where status is quite irrelevant. If possible enough, you may also need a force impact on your weapon, because we will be also using internal bleeding or hemorrhage on your kitgun for the Pax Seeker force impact. Then, Tombfinger secondary kitgun is by far the best. Catchmoon secondary and Sporelacer secondary is also a good choice, but not as good as the Tombfinger secondary kitgun. Now do be aware that all the kitgun will be using almost the same kind of build, which usually the different chamber, but pair out with the haymaker and splat for the maximum damage and crits. If let's say you do not want to use splat, you can also switch it to kill stream for the same amount of crits, except more focus on reload speed rather than magazine. But then again, that's your choice. Now, most of you quite wonder why Catchmoon and Sporelacer cannot beat Tombfinger in terms of using the Pax Seeker. For Catchmoon case, the main problem here is that it really did have high damage, but in order to make up for that high damage, it trades off too many fire rate, which can be a little bit problematic because if let's say you cannot make sure that to one-shot the enemies, then you need to spam the second shot. But the low fire rate causes it not able to spam it in time. Thus, before you manage to land the second shot, the enemies will be dead already. The second problem is that it has a large hitbox rate. Larger hitbox could be much better because it should be allow you to headshot enemies, right? Turns out based on my testing, I found that it didn't really work it that way. Even though you may seem that it really did headshot the enemies, but the Pax Seeker seems to not function that properly, which causing another problem. That's why if let's say that for Catchmoon, I do not prefer to use for the purpose of Pax Seeker. Instead, just usually use for the crowd eliminating. For Sporelacer case will be much more easier to know, because mostly you will use Sporelacer for the radio splash damage, which rarely you will be headshot the enemies. But if let's say you want to headshot, then I can tell you, it don't really have the force impact on it. Thus, you do not really use the hemorrhage mod that often. So even though it seems to be better, and it is indeed much better indeed, But based on my opinions, I don't think it will be good in terms of using the Pax Seeker. Just use what you usually did for your crowd limiting, just like the Catchmoon did. But Tombfinger is quite different because Tombfinger is already designed as a secondary pistol. So if you take a look at Tombfinger itself, the damage is indeed high, even though it didn't match up to Catchmoon, but the damage is already quite high enough to make good use of it. And it also got the force impact, which allow you to naturally go with hemorrhage mod. And most importantly, because it's a pistol itself, I highly think that you will be using the deadhead as well as Pax Seeker a lot of time. Because of this, when you're using the Tombfinger, I will be using this kind of set, and really, until right now, I still think that Pax Seeker pair out quite well with the Tombfinger kitgun. Especially this kind of weapon is actually quite strong enough, even in the steel puff content. It is really good to use it, especially when Pax Seeker use into it, it just turns even better. And one last thing, I highly do not recommend you to use this kind of weapon, more specifically, Pax Seeker with the Tombfinger that I mentioned just now into the survival, especially the steel puff, because it is indeed high damage, but not capable of being a KPM weapon. So that's one thing to understand. And this is it. Pax Seeker is really a good arcane, but usually it will really depending on the kitgun you created. That's why you really need to pick the right kitgun for you to use in order for the Pax Seeker to do the maximum damage. And until right now, only Tombfinger managed to fulfill the condition that Pax Seeker really need to. Even though Catchmoon and Sporelacer can really match up either, but they're already doing their job quite well, and they do not need Pax Seeker help anymore. That's why you rarely use Pax Seeker on these two weapons. But I still think that it's a good trade and you may try to use it. Maybe you can find something that I didn't find either, but who knows. But then again, you can use Pax Seeker on the Tombfinger and try it. If this is your first time watching, why not leave a like and subscribe to my channel so that you won't miss out any news contents from me. Why not leave your comments down below if you got any ideas or thoughts you want to share with all of us. And that's it from me, and as always, I will see you all next time. Bye bye!